It started with a flicker, an anomaly, a low-resolution image from a commercial satellite sweeping over the western Amazon. At first glance, it looked like nothing, a splash of color against the infinite green. But when analysts zoomed in, everything changed. In the heart of Brazil's uncharted rainforest, hundreds of miles from any known road, village, or river, a glint of metal pierced the jungle canopy, not a glimmer of water, not a natural reflection. This was angular, deliberate. Next to it, geometric shadows, too straight to be trees, too regular to be nature. Something was there, something that wasn't supposed to be. The satellite passed overhead again, 2 days later. This time, the shape had shifted. The glint was gone. But something else had appeared, a faded blue tarp, barely visible beneath vines and shadows, a trail of disturbance, broken canopy, disturbed brush. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was moving out there. The scan was flagged, then forwarded to a private analytics firm contracted by a pharmaceutical company researching Amazonian flora. One analyst, trained in pattern recognition, not missing persons, made the connection. 12 years earlier, just a few miles from this location, a father and his teenage son had vanished without a trace. Declared dead. Case closed. Until now. What the satellite had captured wasn't just an unexplained shape. It was a lead. A breadcrumb in a jungle that devours everything it touches. The image traveled quickly, from technician to supervisor, from inbox to inbox, until it landed in front of one woman who had never stopped looking. Sarah Langley stared at the screen, her hands trembling. She didn't need enhanced resolution. She didn't need expert analysis. She knew. Somehow, she knew. The jungle had kept its secret for 12 long years. But now, under the cold mechanical eye of a machine orbiting 300 miles above Earth, the silence was breaking. And what lay beneath that canopy would change everything we thought we knew about survival, isolation, and the human will to adapt. This wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the beginning. And to understand what happened out there, you have to go back to the day 2 people disappeared into the greenest darkness on Earth and never came back. Thomas Langley was the kind of man who didn't just believe in nature, he revered it. A botanist by trade, he spent his life searching for the unexplored corners of the earth, the slivers of forest not yet touched by civilization. He wasn't famous, not in the way some adventurers are, but in academic circles, his name carried weight. He'd published papers on rare fungi found only in the Peruvian highlands. He once mapped an entire orchid ecosystem using only a canoe and a compass. He didn't seek attention. He sought understanding. His son Ethan was 14 when they vanished. Sharp-minded, quiet, and observant, Ethan was what teachers called gifted. Though he hated the term, he didn't care about grades. He cared about meaning. He and his father shared a bond that went beyond blood, both introverts, both dreamers, both curious about a world that didn't make sense in textbooks. When Thomas proposed a field expedition into a previously uncharted section of the Brazilian Amazon, Ethan didn't hesitate. He begged to go, not because it was exotic, but because it felt important. The plan was simple: 2 weeks, a small team, document plant life, take samples, photograph new species. Thomas had clearance, permits, sponsorship, a known route in, and a set rendezvous point on the other side. Everything was accounted for. But then, days before departure, their guide dropped out. The rest of the team pulled back. Thomas faced a choice: cancel the trip or go in alone. He went. Ethan went with him. They departed from Manaus on August 3, 2010, 1 dugout canoe, 2 waterproof backpacks, satellite phone, GPS, emergency beacon, food for 3 weeks, enough gear for a survival documentary. Witnesses saw them leave. They waved, smiled, disappeared down the river. They were never seen again. No distress signal, no last call, just nothing. Thomas Langley wasn't reckless. He was meticulous. But the jungle doesn't care how smart you are. It doesn't care how many degrees you hold. Out there, you're not a scientist. You're not a father. You're not a son. You're just another thing made of flesh and bone, surrounded by a million things that aren't. And when Thomas and Ethan vanished into the trees, the world wrote them off as another tragic statistic. But they weren't lost. Not really. They were waiting to be found. Thomas Langley didn't just want to document plants, he wanted to discover them. The Amazon, with its vast, unmapped regions, remained one of the last frontiers for botanical breakthroughs. And somewhere in its endless green maze, he believed a cure waited, not metaphorically, literally. For years, he'd heard rumors from indigenous communities about a vine that could halt neurodegeneration, a plant that bled red and numbed pain without side effects. Scientists had dismissed it as folklore. Thomas didn't. This wasn't just another research trip. It was the culmination of decades of fieldwork, maps scrawled in the margins of notebooks, plant sketches done by hand in remote villages. He had funding from a small biotech firm. He had government permits. What he didn't have, what no one had, was a way to guarantee safety beyond the marked trails. But he was willing to take that risk. Ethan, too. The plan was to travel by boat from Manaus, follow the Rio Purus until it split off into a network of tributaries, and then continue on foot into what locals called No Man's Grove, a stretch of jungle so dense it hadn't been formally surveyed since the 1970s. The last group to attempt it turned back after 3 days. Thomas packed for 30. They weren't alone, at least not at first. João Silveira, a seasoned local guide who'd worked with Thomas before, agreed to join them. He was wiry, weathered, quiet, a man who knew the jungle by smell and could read the trees like road signs. They also hired a boatman to take them upriver. But once they reached a certain bend, a curve known as Boca da Sombra, the mouth of shadows, everything changed. On August 5th, the trio stepped off the boat and into the undergrowth. The guide radioed back to a contact in Manaus. They're in. It was the last anyone heard from him. What lay ahead was a region unmapped by GPS, untouched by loggers, unknown to even most tribes. It was where maps turned gray, a place without names, a place where even birds stopped singing. Thomas called it a living cathedral. Ethan just called it beautiful. 3 people walked into the jungle that morning. Only 2 were ever searched for, and neither came back. August 8, 2010, 10:42 a.m. The final transmission. Thomas's voice was calm, confident, routine. Still heading southwest. Dense canopy, slower progress than expected, all good. That was it. 14 words, then static. No emergency code, no hint of distress, no follow-up. The signal didn't cut out, it just never came again. At first, no one panicked. Jungle expeditions often went dark for a few days, especially in dense regions where satellite phones struggled for a clear shot at the sky. Sarah Langley kept checking her inbox, refreshing her phone, waiting for a ping that never came. Joan's wife tried his radio. Nothing. The biotech sponsor sent a message to the local contact who had dropped them at the river bend. Still, nothing. By day 3, concern became urgency. By day 5, it was fear. The Brazilian authorities were notified. A float plane was dispatched from Manaus. A search boat traced the river route, then doubled back. From the air, the trees looked like an infinite green ocean, beautiful and utterly indifferent. Search and rescue teams dropped into the forest at several known entry points, but the GPS tracker Thomas had carried wasn't pinging. Either it had failed, or it had been turned off. The local guide João was presumed to have vanished along with them. No one reported seeing him return. The boatman who'd ferried them upriver was questioned, twice. His story stayed the same. They went in with smiles and a machete. That's all I saw. Over the next 2 weeks, a grid search was conducted, more than 80 square miles of terrain, covered by foot and helicopter. Not a single trace. No boot prints. No broken branches. Not even an old campfire. It was as if the jungle had swallowed them whole. The mystery deepened when data from Thomas's satellite phone was analyzed. No outgoing pings after August 8th. But the phone hadn't died. It had remained on for another 11 hours. Then it, too, went silent. That detail haunted Sarah the most. It suggested choice, intent. Something had happened after that last radio message, but what? Theories ranged from the logical, snakebite, injury, flash flood, to the sinister, illegal loggers, hostile tribes, poachers protecting hidden operations. But the truth was worse. There was no sign of struggle, because whatever happened next left nothing behind. Only silence. On the third day of silence, the call was made. Officially, Thomas Langley and his son Ethan were listed as overdue, but not yet missing. Unofficially, the dread had already set in. The biotech sponsor authorized an emergency response. Brazil's environmental police, IBAMA, dispatched a reconnaissance helicopter from Tefé. The first flight yielded nothing but endless green, not even a wisp of smoke, not a single flash of color against the canopy. The next wave was more aggressive. Ground teams, armed with machetes and maps that barely made sense, began their approach. Local indigenous guides joined, many from tribes who had oral histories of that part of the forest. Some refused to enter. Others went only so far before turning back. One man said, "The jungle beyond Boca da Sombra does not welcome men." He would not elaborate. Over the next 10 days, search and rescue swept over 100 square kilometers. Thermal drones, night vision-equipped teams, canine units. Nothing. Even the most skilled trackers found no trail, no boot prints, no broken branches, no signs of disturbed wildlife. It was as if the jungle had sealed itself shut behind the missing. Sarah Langley flew to Manaus, pleading with authorities for more resources. A press conference was held. News outlets picked up the story of the missing botanist and his teenage son. For a moment, it seemed like the world might care. But the Amazon doesn't play by human timelines. Rain fell, trails washed away, mosquitoes bred, jungle rot set in. Helicopters were grounded for days at a time due to storms that turned the air black by noon. Equipment failed. Communications went dark. Search teams came back exhausted, bitten, and empty-handed. Then came the 30-day mark. Most jungle rescues, when they happen at all, happen within the first 72 hours. After that, it becomes a recovery operation. After 30 days, it becomes a question no one wants to ask. Where did they go? How could two people leave zero trace? And if they were still alive, how had they survived? The search was scaled back. One team remained. They would stay another week. That was all. Then the jungle would close around the mystery once again, and the world would move on. The Amazon is not a forest. It's a living organism, a sprawling, breathing entity that covers over 2 million square miles. It pulses with heat, with rot, with hunger. And every inch of it wants to consume. The dangers don't scream, they creep. Jaguars move in silence, their spotted coats blending into the shadows. One bite, perfectly placed at the base of the skull, and it's over. No noise, no struggle, just a vanished shape in the dark. But it's not the predators you should fear. It's the parasites. Botflies that lay eggs under your skin. Leishmaniasis that eats away at the face one cell at a time. Tiny worms that burrow through bare feet and nest in your bloodstream. Bacteria in the river that enter your eyes. Infections that blossom overnight. And then there's the land itself. Unmarked sinkholes, swallowed by vegetation, can drop 20 feet into a tomb of wet mud and bone. Flash floods turn dry trails into rivers in minutes. Fallen logs aren't logs, they're anacondas, or worse. Entire trees rot from the inside, collapsing without warning. Even your own sweat betrays you, drawing in clouds of mosquitoes that bite through clothes and carry malaria, dengue, and worse. It's not just death, it's disorientation. Compasses fail under the canopy. GPS loses signal. The dense foliage muffles sound. Your own voice, your own scream. Day turns to night in the blink of an eye. It doesn't take long to forget which way you came or who you are. Every year, an estimated 3,000 people vanish in the Amazon basin. Most are never found. Some are illegal loggers. Others are tourists who stray too far. A few are scientists, just like Thomas Langley, who venture beyond the grid, chasing discovery and walking straight into oblivion. Locals have a name for it: Osumiso, the vanishing. No blood, no bones, just gone. And the longer Thomas and Ethan remained missing, the more people began to accept what the forest already knew. The jungle doesn't lose things. It keeps them forever. Thomas Langley didn't believe in fences, not metaphorical ones, and certainly not the ones drawn on maps. To him, restricted zones were just lines drawn by people who hadn't bothered to go far enough. He wasn't arrogant, he wasn't reckless. But he believed the jungle had more to teach than any textbook ever could, if you were willing to listen. He had a reputation in scientific circles, not quite infamous, but definitely notorious, not for breaking laws, but for bending them. In Peru, he once crossed into protected tribal land after hearing rumors of a plant used in childbirth rituals. In Bolivia, he camped alone for 11 days just to photograph a bioluminescent fungus. He believed knowledge was worth the risk. That discovery required discomfort. He wanted to go deeper than anyone had before, said Dr. Priya Chandran, a former colleague. But the thing about Thomas? He didn't need to be first. He just couldn't stand being stuck. Some admired him, others worried. He was always chasing something, said his grad student, Leo Harmon. A species, a truth, maybe even a ghost. Thomas was meticulous with gear, careful with notes. But it was his mindset that scared people. He trusted the jungle too much, trusted it to reveal, to protect, to reward his curiosity. And he brought Ethan into that belief like a father passing down a family heirloom. Many questioned that decision. 14's too young, one colleague said, not physically, psychologically. That place doesn't just test your body, it tests your mind. But Thomas saw it differently. He believed Ethan was ready, not just for the science, but for the silence, for the feeling of being small beneath something vast and alive. And maybe that's what made his disappearance so tragic. It wasn't a surprise. Not really, because people had always said this was how he'd go, not in a lab or a lecture hall, but deep in the green, chasing something the rest of the world didn't believe existed, and taking his son with him. The house is quiet now, too quiet. The walls are still lined with Ethan's books, dog-eared copies of field guides, adventure novels, and journals filled with messy sketches of leaves, insects, and snakes. His microscope still sits in the corner of his room, untouched. The lens cap is on, but the light is still plugged in, always ready, just in case. Sarah Langley doesn't change the room. She dusts it weekly, changes the sheets, replaces batteries in his flashlight. He'll need it when he comes home, she says. She speaks softly, with a tightness in her voice that never leaves. The kind of restraint you develop when you've said the same sentence 1,000 times. I don't believe they're gone. Because to Sarah, disappearance isn't death, it's absence, and absence can be undone. The moment I heard they were missing, I didn't panic, she says. Thomas is smart. Ethan, too. They've camped, navigated, studied this stuff. I thought maybe they lost signal, maybe the radio failed. I refused to believe the worst. But the silence dragged on. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The hardest part wasn't the not knowing. It was everyone else deciding for me, she says. They closed the case, called it presumed dead, sent me forms to sign. She didn't. She never signed them. Instead, Sarah launched her own search. She drained savings, hired independent trackers, paid for satellite imagery. She joined online forums for missing persons, contacted shamans, botanists, ex-military survivalists. Some called her desperate. She calls it hope. I still get dreams, she says. Sometimes I see Ethan. He's older now, taller, wearing jungle clothes. He always smiles, but never speaks. I wake up crying, but it's not sadness. it's something else, like a message. Sarah doesn't believe in ghosts. She believes in her son. I think they're alive. Somewhere out there. I don't know how. I don't need to know how. I just feel it. The world moved on. News stories faded. Donations dried up. But Sarah never stopped searching. Because love doesn't follow search protocols or government timelines. Love waits. And Sarah Langley is still waiting. 41 days after Thomas and Ethan disappeared, a Brazilian fire patrol team, searching for signs of illegal burning, stumbled across something strange. It wasn't a fire. It wasn't even on their search grid. It was a clearing, a narrow break in the foliage, almost invisible unless you were looking straight down from the ridge. Inside it, a campsite. What was left of one, anyway. A collapsed tarp, half-eaten by vines. A fire ring, long cold. A torn backpack, its zipper rusted shut. Everything was soaked, soft, starting to rot. But it hadn't been there forever. Maybe weeks, maybe less. They radioed for support. Within hours, a search team was airlifted in to document the site. It wasn't much, but it was something. Scraps of field notes, pages from a waterproof journal, the ink still faintly legible. One page had Ethan's name scribbled on it. Another had a drawing of a plant no one recognized. There was a pair of water filters, both clogged with sediment, a cracked lens from a GPS unit, a compass that spun in place, but no sign of Thomas, no sign of Ethan, no bones, no clothing, no blood, just scratches. On a nearby tree, a series of shallow cuts, not made by an animal, too even, too deliberate, like tally marks, 26 of them carved in a straight vertical line, and below them 3 horizontal slashes, deep and jagged. A message? A count? No one could say. For a moment, hope returned. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe they left the site intentionally. But which direction? And why hadn't they left a trail? Trackers circled outward. Drones flew overhead. Dogs sniffed for scent. Nothing. No footprints, no drag marks, no sign they were ever even injured. It was the only physical evidence ever recovered. And it made no sense. Because for all the effort, all the money, all the bodies in the field, the forest had only offered one thing in return, a single whisper. Then silence. On November 12, 2010, the Brazilian authorities made it official. The Langley expedition was declared a fatal loss. There were no leads, no bodies, no movement on the trackers. The case was filed under disappearance under extreme environmental conditions. It was cold, and it was closed. The ceremony was quiet. Just a few officials, a signed report, and a letter mailed to Sarah Langley explaining that, after 90 days, search protocol dictated a shift from rescue to recovery, and from recovery to none at all. Sarah read it once, then again. Then she folded it in half and put it in a drawer she never opened again. Others tried to comfort her. "At least you can find closure," someone said at the memorial. Another person told her, "They're at peace now." Someone else whispered, "Maybe this is what Thomas wanted." She smiled politely, nodded when appropriate, then went home and reopened every file she had. She marked the last GPS ping on the wall map in red. She printed out the final journal page. She stared at those 3 jagged slashes over and over. "They're not dead," she whispered. "They didn't die. They disappeared." There's a difference. She knew it in her bones, the same way a mother knows her child's voice in a crowded room, the same way you feel someone looking at you in the dark. Dead things leave remains. But Thomas and Ethan had left only space, a space she wasn't ready to fill with grief. So while the world moved on and the university archived Thomas's work, Sarah kept searching. She reached out to satellite firms, bought imagery in bulk. She studied the terrain, traced tributaries, followed weather patterns. She connected with tribes, former trackers, even conspiracy theorists. Not because she believed them, but because she had to believe something. Others called it obsession. She called it motherhood. And in that silence, one only the jungle can create, Sarah made a promise. "If you're out there, I'll find you." 12 years would pass. And then the jungle would speak again. The memorial took place on a cloudy Sunday in early December. A rented hall, fold-out chairs, a photo slideshow that flickered just a little too slowly. Thomas Langley's colleagues spoke first about his contributions to plant ecology, his daring expeditions, his love of learning. There were words like trailblazer, visionary, fearless, words people say when they can't explain a disappearance, so they romanticize it instead. Ethan's teachers spoke next. A science teacher choked up. "He once corrected me on the classification of a beetle," she said, smiling through tears, and he was right. A classmate read a letter Ethan had written about wanting to live where the world still breathes. The crowd laughed gently, cried quietly. Then came the plaque, mounted in the hallway of Ethan's middle school. "In memory of Ethan Langley, curious, kind, unafraid." A black and white photo showed a boy with wild hair and a lopsided grin, holding a notebook, mud on his sleeves. Thomas's research was cataloged and stored in a university archive, his unfinished field notes, sketches, and a list of plants he hoped to find. They were boxed, labeled, and shelved in a climate-controlled room no one ever visited. His final grant report was never filed, his last expedition never published. Eventually, a grad student borrowed his GPS logs for a project. They found a corrupted file, deleted it. Within months, the media moved on. A new election, a celebrity scandal, another missing person case. People stopped asking Sarah how she was doing, not because they stopped caring, but because they expected her to start forgetting, to heal, to accept. She didn't. She couldn't. Because healing implies finality. And there was nothing final about any of this, just an echo that wouldn't stop repeating. It began with sleepless nights, then notebooks, then maps. Then the jungle came to live with her, sprawled across her living room wall in satellite photos, expedition diagrams, river paths marked in red and green and black. She memorized rainfall patterns, studied canopy density. She learned to read topography the way others read bedtime stories. Sarah Langley became fluent in obsession. She stopped waiting for permission, hired her own analysts, bought high-resolution satellite imagery from private aerospace firms. She sifted through scans frame by frame, pixel by pixel, looking for anything. A change in light, a shadow that hadn't been there before. Twice she thought she saw smoke. Once, something metallic. Every time she sent someone in, they came back empty. She wasn't deterred. She contacted private trackers, former park rangers, indigenous guides, anyone with boots and a machete and no fear of the dark. She posted rewards, built a digital archive, consulted shamans in Peru. One told her Ethan was alive, between worlds. She didn't believe him. Not exactly, but she didn't disbelieve him either. She kept the final image from the abandoned camp on her fridge, the tree with the slashes, the 3 jagged cuts beneath the tally marks. She believed it meant something, a warning, a countdown, or a message left by a boy who knew his mother would never stop looking. Her family told her to rest. Her friends urged therapy. She thanked them, smiled, and went back to scanning satellite grids until 3 a.m. Sarah had one rule: never close the map, because the moment she did, the jungle would win. And she hadn't spent 12 years losing just to give up now. Something was out there. She could feel it. And soon, the jungle would show her. The jungle forgets nothing. While the world turned away from the Langley case, the forest held on. And in its deeper corners, where GPS signals fade and tribal memory still rules, rumors began to surface. The first came from a trader who supplied remote villages along the Tapajos River. He mentioned it casually between drinks, how a boy with pale skin and piercing blue eyes had been spotted by the Carapa people 8 years ago. He didn't speak, the trader said, just watched. From the edge of the trees, when the villagers approached, he disappeared. They called him O Fantasma Branco, the White Phantom. Others started whispering about strange sightings. A figure in handmade clothing glimpsed near a fishing camp, vanishing before dawn. Tools made from metal and bone, found where no outsiders had been. A voice singing in a language no one recognized. soft, melodic, drifting through the canopy at night, like wind through reeds. The stories were inconsistent, scattered, but Sarah collected every one. Some spoke of a boy with jungle scars and hair down to his shoulders, accompanied by a man who never spoke but carved symbols into the bark of rubber trees. Others claimed the boy traveled alone, barefoot, silent, leaving only woven charms behind in the branches, twisted leaves, feathers, stones tied with vine cord. A local medicine woman said she'd seen him near the river. "He's not lost," she told Sarah. "He chose the forest." Sarah didn't care what he chose. If it was Ethan, if it was even possibly Ethan, then the story wasn't over. Maybe it had never been a disappearance. Maybe it had been an escape. But from what? Or from whom? It surfaced in Leticia, Colombia, just across the Brazilian border. A black market dealer known for selling antiquities offered a tattered field journal to a private collector. Worn leather cover, molded corners, water damage along the spine. But the pages inside were gold. Notes on rare plant life, sketches of root systems, botanical terminology scribbled in both English and Latin, and at the bottom of most pages, a single name in fading ink. Thomas Langley. The collector was no botanist, but he knew the name. Word got out. Within a week, a photo of one of the journal pages landed in Sarah's inbox. She zoomed in on the handwriting. It was his, no doubt. She would have recognized it in 1,000 different samples. But that wasn't the part that stole the breath from her lungs. The dates? The journal had entries from 2011, a full year after the expedition was declared lost. One page mentioned a vine with red sap and described how it numbed the tongue in under 10 seconds. Another detailed animal behavior, monkeys using stripped branches to test water depth. But it was the sketches that struck Sarah hardest. One was of a shelter, another showed a series of markings carved into trees, and then, almost lost in the margins, a crude drawing of a boy. Thin, shirtless, barefoot, holding what looked like a hand-carved spear. No face. Just 2 circles where the eyes should be. Sarah sent the journal for forensic verification. It came back authenticated. Ink tested fresh as of 2011, paper made in Brazil, matching Thomas's field notes from previous expeditions. It wasn't planted. It was real. And if the notebook was real, then so was the nightmare. Because someone had survived, and they were still writing. Sarah flipped through the pages of the journal like a lifeline. She'd read it all a dozen times already. Every sketch, every scribbled note, every cryptic phrase that might have meant nothing or everything. But on the 13th pass, she noticed something she'd missed. Near the center of the book, pressed between 2 pages like a secret too afraid to be seen, was a loose sheet, damp around the edges, folded twice. Inside was a rough sketch of a plant she didn't recognize. Broad leaves, a thick, curling stem, and blossoms that looked like they were weeping. Below it, a strange phrase written in shaky block letters. Not in the guidebooks. And beneath that, coordinates. Latitude and longitude, handwritten in ink that had bled slightly with water but remained legible. Sarah entered them into her laptop. They pointed to a spot deep in the Brazilian Amazon near the Tapajós headwaters. The nearest village was over 90 miles away. No known trails, no flight paths, not even illegal logging roads. She didn't call the police. She didn't tell the embassy. Instead, she contacted someone who owed her a favor, an engineer named Rajiv at a private aerospace firm that conducted ecological scans for pharmaceutical clients. She sent the coordinates with a single message. I need a scan. High-res, infrared, thermal if you can. It's personal. Rajiv didn't ask questions. 2 days later, he had access to an upcoming satellite pass scheduled for atmospheric analysis. It was unmanned, automated, and aimed at a section of forest no one had touched in decades. He redirected the focus just slightly and waited. Sarah barely slept that night. 12 years, thousands of false leads. But this felt different. The image arrived on August 5th, exactly 12 years to the day since Thomas and Ethan vanished into the jungle. At first glance, it was just more of the same. trees, shadows, green waves of canopy stretching endlessly in every direction. But then the AI pinged a detail. In the northwest quadrant of the image, barely a pixel wide, was a glint. Rajiv zoomed, enhanced, ran it through thermal filters. What he saw didn't make sense. It was something reflective, man-made, sharp-edged. A rectangle, roughly 6 by 8 feet, partially obscured by vines and branches. Too symmetrical to be rock, too angular to be natural, the kind of shape the jungle doesn't make on its own. Near it, another anomaly, a discoloration in the canopy, slightly paler, like something had thinned or been cut away. A clearing? Number? Too small? More like a footprint. A shelter? Rajiv reran the thermal data. There were heat signatures, faint, fuzzy, too large for monkeys, too small for large cats, but not zero. He sent the file to Sarah without a word. She opened it. Froze. There it was. A glint of metal, possibly a solar panel, and nearby an unnatural indentation in the foliage. A shape like a roof, maybe a tarp, maybe something else. But the moment that stopped her breath? Just to the south of the reflective shape, hidden beneath a patch of thinned canopy, stood a figure, blurry, small, upright, human. The satellite couldn't capture a face, no way to know for sure. But Sarah knew. She knew. And after 12 long years, the jungle had finally blinked. Something was alive out there, and it was watching. At first it looked like noise, just a smear of pixels beneath the canopy, but when the image was enhanced, frame by frame, filter by filter, the shape began to take form. Not a rock, not an animal, a structure. Analysts at the aerospace firm layered high-resolution scans with light spectrum data. The result was stunning. A reflective rectangle made of rigid material, partially obscured by vines. One end appeared slightly tilted. Analysts speculated it might be a solar panel. But who in their right mind was deploying solar tech that deep in the Amazon? Beneath the structure, the foliage had been flattened, not cleared like a construction site, pressed down like it had been walked on again and again. A trail, faint but visible, curved southward from the object and disappeared into a wall of green. Then came the thermal overlay. The heat signature was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, not animal. The temperature wasn't right, not fire, too compact. Whatever it was stationary and alive. Sarah leaned in close, heart hammering, as the final enhanced frame loaded. Just outside the thinned clearing to the left of the structure, half covered in shadow, stood a shape. It wasn't a bush, or a stump, or a trick of the light. It was a human silhouette, upright, still, facing the satellite. The arms hung naturally, the figure was thin, angular, possibly shirtless. Too small to be Thomas, but tall enough, just tall enough, to be Ethan. A teenager, no longer. Sarah didn't cry. She didn't breathe. She just whispered 2 words, "He's alive." And with that, the search was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it was on. It took Sarah less than 48 hours to decide. She wasn't calling a government agency. She was done waiting. Using what remained of her retirement and a sizable anonymous donation from a former colleague of Thomas's, she commissioned a private expedition, 2 ex-military trackers, a survivalist drone operator, and a Brazilian fixer with deep jungle contacts and no fear of restricted zones. She knew the risks. The coordinates sat inside a stretch of jungle near the Tapajos National Forest, close to land claimed, but not patrolled, by military environmental protection units. The area was not open to foreign entry. No roads, no surveillance, no laws. She sent a request to the Brazilian government for supervised access. The response came 2 days later. Area restricted due to ecological risk and indigenous sovereignty. Entry strongly discouraged, and in smaller print. Unregistered entry may result in detention. But it wasn't just red tape. An official Sarah spoke to off the record gave her a warning. "The jungle is strange there," he said. "People go missing. Not tourists, locals, hunters, rangers. It's not just terrain. It's something else." Sarah asked what he meant. He didn't answer. The team assembled anyway. They packed light, rations, medical kits, satellite uplinks, machetes, a solar-powered drone. No guns, Brazilian law forbade it. But they carried knives and, more importantly, experience. Each member had seen combat zones, disease outbreaks, disappearances. None had seen what they were about to find. The plan was to chopper in from a remote logging camp, then hike 20 kilometers through known terrain before veering into the unknown, guided only by GPS, gut instinct, and a satellite image of a boy who might not want to be found. Sarah wasn't going with them. But as they lifted off, she handed the lead tracker a folded photograph. It was Ethan, age 14. "Find him," she said, "and tell him I never stopped." No one spoke during takeoff, because they all knew somewhere in that jungle, the lost had become something else. And they were about to walk straight into it. They dropped in just after dawn. The helicopter hovered over a clearing barely wide enough for the blades to breathe. Below, a wall of green so dense it looked solid. The moment the team's boots hit the ground, the jungle swallowed the noise and the light. Within seconds, the canopy above sealed shut like a wound. The air was wet, heavy. Breathing felt like drinking. Sweat poured before anyone moved. Mosquitoes arrived instantly, black clouds drawn to fresh blood, undeterred by repellent. The jungle buzzed with life until it didn't. Then it was just silence. Real silence. Not peaceful, but predatory, like the trees themselves were watching. The lead tracker, Duarte, a veteran of more than a dozen deep jungle missions, muttered the local nickname under his breath. Inferno Verde, Green Hell. Everything was a threat. Spiked vines disguised as grass sliced open forearms. Red ants fell like rain from overhead, crawling into collars, stinging ankles through socks. The team moved in tight formation, machetes cutting a narrow path as the forest tried to close behind them. No trails, no signs of human passage, just tangled roots, dripping leaves, and the endless, suffocating heat. Every few hours they stopped, to hydrate, to recalibrate, to listen. But there was nothing to hear. No birdsong, no monkeys, not even the distant rush of water. Just that feeling, the one that crawls up the back of your neck when you're being watched. The drone operator, Vic, launched a compact quadcopter during one break. It rose above the canopy, feeding thermal data to the group's tablet. But the humidity warped signal quality. Battery life drained rapidly. The jungle didn't want machines here. Still, they pressed on. By day 2, they were within 5 kilometers of the coordinates Sarah had given them. Tension settled over the group like fog. They weren't just chasing ghosts anymore. They were inside the ghost's home. And someone, was moving just beyond their sight. On the morning of day 3, Duarte found the smoke. Faint, almost a mist. But it carried the unmistakable scent of burnt citrus and crushed leaf. An old trick used to repel insects. Not the kind of fire left by loggers. This was intentional, survival-based, clever, and fresh. They killed the drone, killed the chatter, moved slow. Within an hour, the jungle gave them something else. Vic spotted it first, low on a tree trunk, barely above the mudline, a symbol carved into the bark, crude but deliberate. A circle intersected by 3 uneven lines, like a compass or a warning. It didn't match any known tribal iconography. Duarte took a photo, but his face said everything. He'd never seen it before. They moved forward cautiously, tracing a path along what felt like a faint animal trail, until Maya, the team's medic, froze mid-step. Footprint! The others rushed in. There in the damp soil, a partial print. Human, narrow, unshod, the heel incomplete but the toes clear. It couldn't have been more than a few days old. No overlapping animal tracks, no signs of dragging or limping. Whoever made it wasn't just alive. They were moving well. Duarte crouched next to it, running a hand over the indent. His voice dropped to a whisper. That's not a child's foot anymore. Sarah had sent them to find a boy. But what they were tracking might no longer be a boy at all. As they stood there, an eerie sound passed through the trees. Not an animal, not the wind. A single whistle. Low, sustained, almost human. Then nothing, just the throb of their own hearts, and the certainty that the jungle wasn't hiding anymore. It was responding. By the afternoon of day 3, they were moving slower. Not because they were tired, though they were, but because the jungle was changing. The foliage was thinning, not naturally, but intentionally. Underfoot, the roots had been cleared. Not much, just enough for someone to move quietly, stealthily, repeatedly. They followed the trail in single file, and then they saw it. Hidden behind a curtain of thick vines and tree ferns stood a structure, impossible, out of place, and yet alive with the forest. It wasn't a hut. It wasn't a tent. It was something built, something designed. Metal ribs curved around one side like the skeleton of a crashed aircraft, fused with branches, mud, palm leaves, and scavenged debris. One corner held a cracked solar panel, barely functional, tilted on an angle toward the breaks in the canopy. Tarps were woven into the roof. Tools, hand-carved and rusted, hung from vines. Empty cans had been scrubbed clean and repurposed as water catchers. Everything was improvised. Everything was intentional. This was not an abandoned campsite. This was a home. Duarte motioned for silence. They circled the perimeter. No tripwires, no movement. Just the quiet hum of insects and the soft rattle of leaves overhead. Inside, they found a hammock made of stitched vines, a journal bound with palm fiber, carvings, crude faces, leaves, maps etched into tree bark and strung together like pages, dozens of them. This wasn't a temporary shelter. It was a life lived day after day, year after year. Vic stepped into the center and whispered what everyone was thinking. Someone's still here. Then, from the trees behind them, came a sound. Not a twig, not a bird, a breath. Close, human. He didn't run. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, as if he'd been watching them for hours. Maybe he had. The vines parted and the man emerged. Gaunt, weathered, hair down to his shoulders, streaked with gray. A tangled beard clung to a jawline thinned by years of hunger. His skin was tanned to leather. His clothes, if they could still be called that, were hand-woven from plant fiber, reinforced with pieces of torn nylon, faded patches of military tarp, and stitched leaves. Around his neck, a strip of metal served as a pendant, what looked like part of a broken compass. His eyes, bloodshot, sunken, locked onto Duarte. Then to Maya, then to the photo Vic still held in his hand. He stepped closer, slowly, warily, and spoke. His voice was dry, hollow, like the echo of someone who hadn't used words in weeks. "He's not here." Duarte's grip tightened on his machete. The man's face twisted with emotion, relief, pain, guilt, something deeper. Maya took a step forward. "Who are you?" she asked gently. He stared for a long moment, then answered. "Thomas Langley." Silence. Even the jungle seemed to pause. The man who had vanished 12 years ago, written off, buried in memory, memorialized on plaques, stood right in front of them. Alive. Broken, but standing. And alone. Sarah's team had come looking for Ethan. But they'd found Thomas instead. And the real mystery, the one no one was prepared for, was why. They offered him water, food, medical attention. He refused most of it. Thomas Langley didn't speak much at first. He sat beneath the shelter's awning, back against a tree he had carved symbols into. His hands trembled when he held the food packet. His lips cracked when he drank, but his eyes stayed clear, alert, staring past the rescue team as if watching something none of them could see. The question came gently. "Where's Ethan?" He didn't answer. Not immediately. Only after the light began to fade and the heat gave way to damp night did he speak again. "Ethan stayed." "Stayed where?" Thomas looked up, slow and deliberate. "Here, in the jungle." The team exchanged glances. Duarte pressed gently. "He's alive?" Thomas's eyes filled, but he didn't cry. His voice lowered to a whisper, like a confession offered to the trees. He didn't want to come back. There was silence, the kind that doesn't ask for explanation, only understanding. "I tried," Thomas continued. "I begged. But he changed, became part of this place." He looked down at his hands. I didn't lose him to death. I lost him to something else. Did he run? Maya asked. Thomas shook his head. He walked away, smiling. His voice cracked. He said he belonged here. They didn't press further that night, because it was clear Thomas wasn't just a survivor. He was a man who had been left behind. It came in pieces, broken sentences, shaky hands, pauses long enough to make you think he'd stop talking for good, but the story took shape. The guide, Jaume, had disappeared on day 2. No sound, no struggle, just gone. One moment walking 10 feet ahead, the next, missing. Thomas and Ethan searched for him until nightfall, calling his name, retracing their steps. Nothing. Just unfamiliar trails and the sound of water in the distance. When they returned to camp, they found the radio smashed, trampled, or thrown. They never figured out which. They waited, one night, then another. By the 3rd day, they knew. They were alone. They rationed food, stretched their supplies, gathered rainwater using tarps and leaves. Thomas recognized edible roots. Ethan learned to trap fish using vines. They built a new fire every night, careful not to stay in one place too long. Thomas marked trees with symbols to track direction. It worked, until the rains came. Weeks blurred together. They found a cave, slept in trees, learned which birds meant predators were near. One day they discovered the shelter, what Thomas later confirmed was the tail section of a downed ultralight plane. The wreckage had been there for years. They salvaged what they could, reinforced it, made it theirs. That's when things shifted. Ethan began to change. He stopped talking about home. He stopped asking about rescue. He stopped hoping, but not in despair, in acceptance. He started carving things, symbols, patterns in trees. He listened more than he spoke. And one night he said something Thomas never forgot. What if this is where we're supposed to be? Thomas dismissed it, chalked it up to stress, trauma, malnutrition. But Ethan didn't waver. He stopped wearing shoes, learned to mimic bird calls. Once Thomas caught him eating something they hadn't tested. He was fine. He knew it would be fine. Thomas was surviving. But Ethan was adapting. And then, one morning, Thomas woke up to find a single carving on the shelter wall, a spiral, and beneath it, a line of text. "I'll come back when you're ready." Ethan was gone, no trail, no supplies, just that message. And the feeling that he wasn't lost, he was becoming. At first, Thomas thought it was imagination, isolation, hunger. He'd seen the warnings in survival manuals, how solitude fractures the mind, how the forest plays tricks when you're low on calories and hope. But Ethan wasn't breaking. He was changing. It began with a voice, not English, not Portuguese. Ethan whispered it like a prayer, words he hadn't learned from his father, words not written in any guidebook. When Thomas asked where he'd heard it, Ethan just smiled. "They come at night," he said once. "Who?" Thomas asked. But Ethan was already walking away. Thomas followed him once, through thickets and vines, down a ravine lined with stone markers he hadn't noticed before. At the base, Ethan knelt near a ring of stones, burnt leaves, symbols carved into bark in perfect symmetry. Thomas recognized none of it. Ethan called them the others, uncontacted, silent, invisible, not shadows, not ghosts. A tribe that never left the old ways, that didn't need the outside world. He said they watched from the trees, left gifts, fruit placed just so, clean water in a carved bowl, clay figures that resembled animals they hadn't seen in months. Thomas never saw them, but Ethan did. "They taught him how to live without the world," Thomas said softly, his voice barely holding itself together. "How to disappear." The boy who once sketched leaf veins and read field guides by flashlight now walked barefoot, his feet hard as bark. He braided vines into snares, sang to birds, disappeared into the forest for hours, only to return with a new fruit, a new word, a new wound he wouldn't explain. Thomas begged him to stay close, but Ethan only replied with silence, or worse, reverence. He didn't want to be rescued, Thomas said. He wanted to belong, and slowly he did. It happened on a morning thick with fog. Thomas woke to the quiet, the kind that sinks in like a warning. The birds weren't calling. No insects buzzed. Even the leaves seemed to hold their breath. Ethan's hammock was empty. At first, it wasn't unusual. Sometimes he wandered off to gather water or track an animal he claimed was watching them. But an hour passed, then 2, then 4. Thomas found the message carved into a plank of salvaged metal near the shelter. This is home now. No panic, no goodbye, just certainty. He followed the trail, barely visible, but fresh. A few steps here, a snapped vine there, then nothing. Like Ethan had vanished into the very fabric of the jungle. Thomas waited. 1 day, 2, a week. He searched until the forest turned against him, until his strength gave out, until the food ran low. Then he returned to the shelter and waited, carving symbols of his own, mirroring Ethan's, not to follow, but to remember. He never saw his son again. But sometimes, on windless nights when the stars cut through the canopy, he heard him, whispers in a language he didn't know, footsteps that never reached the camp. A faint melody hummed from just beyond the trees. Maybe it was grief, maybe it was madness, or maybe Ethan had truly become part of the forest. Not lost, chosen. Duarte said nothing as Thomas finished his story. Maya wiped a tear from her cheek. Vic stared into the trees like expecting someone to step out, but no one came. Just the jungle, dense, alive, and eternal. And somewhere within it, a boy who had left behind the world to belong to something older. Thomas didn't have much. A satchel made from bark cloth and vines bound with salvaged cord. Inside it, the remains of a notebook, pages stitched together from leaves, waterproofed with resin, faded ink, symbols, field notes, some in Ethan's hand, some in Thomas's, and photographs, dozens. Worn, scratched, but intact, prints developed using sun-powered kits and repurposed chemicals from old med kits. The images were grainy, imperfect, and astonishing. Close-ups of vines with translucent sap, roots that glowed faintly under moonlight. A flower Thomas had sketched years earlier from rumor alone, blood-red petals curled inward like a fist. One image showed Ethan, older, shirtless, holding a branch with a blossom no scientist had ever documented. When the expedition returned the evidence to the biotech firm that had once funded Thomas's original trip, the findings were examined under a microscope. One species had no match in the global botanical database. A new genus, possibly medicinal, possibly more. The implications were vast, but the miracle wasn't just in the plants. Thomas, upon extraction, was subjected to standard medical protocol, tests, scans, blood panels, and the results were strange. He showed signs of exposure to parasites that should have killed him, but didn't. Markers in his blood hinted at immunological adaptations rarely seen outside of controlled laboratory conditions. His gut flora had changed entirely. His tolerance for certain toxins was abnormally high. One doctor called it biological acclimation accelerated beyond known limits. Another whispered something different. The forest changed him. But all the evidence, the photos, the samples, the notes, only confirmed one thing beyond all doubt. They had survived. For years, and Ethan had thrived, until he walked away. Extraction was quiet. No news crews, no press conferences, just a small helicopter, a long flight, and a transfer to a secure medical facility outside Manaus. Sarah was waiting. She ran to him, arms outstretched. But the man she held wasn't the husband she remembered. He hugged her, weakly, then pulled away, eyes lost in something far behind her. He didn't cry, neither did she. But their silence said everything. The reunion was brief. Thomas was kept in isolation for testing, observation, interviews. Government officials came, scientists came, offers came. He said little. When asked what he wanted, he only replied, to go back. They didn't let him. The jungle had taken 12 years from him. It had taken his son. And in return it had given him something indescribable, something sacred, something that lived behind his eyes now, always flickering just below the surface. Pride and grief fought for space in his hollowed chest. He had survived. He had brought back proof. But he had left behind the only thing that mattered. And he knew, every night as he lay under white hospital lights instead of the canopy sky, that the jungle still held Ethan, not as a prisoner, but as its child. It came quietly weeks after Thomas's extraction. An anonymous tip, a single image, no context, no metadata, just coordinates scribbled into the body of the email. The photo was captured by a survey drone operated by an independent mapping outfit hired to monitor deforestation, several hundred kilometers from where Thomas had been found. Most of the images were useless: canopy, river, foliage too thick to see through. But one frame showed a gap, a momentary clearing, likely the result of a fallen tree or old burn. And in that sliver of light, a figure. He stood half hidden by brush, barefoot, shirtless, lean, muscled from survival, not gym training. Woven cloth wrapped around his waist. His chest was marked with faded pigment, patterns, perhaps tribal. He held a spear tipped with sharpened bone and what looked like carved obsidian. And he was watching the drone. Not startled, not afraid, just aware. His hair hung past his shoulders, tangled and sun-bleached. His skin was dark from years beneath the sun, but the eyes, icy blue, cut through the distance with surgical clarity. There was no mistaking them. It was Ethan. Older, changed, alive. The photo made its way back to Sarah. She didn't share it with the media. She didn't tell Thomas. She printed it, framed it, hung it above Ethan's bed, next to the microscope, the unfinished field guide, the flashlight still waiting for him on the nightstand. And every night she looked at it and whispered, "Come home if you want to, but only if you're ready." Because now she understood. Some people don't get lost. Some people leave. The jungle gave them a story, but not all of it. Thomas never learned what tribe, if any, had taken Ethan in. No known group matched the symbols or customs described in his journals. Anthropologists speculated he'd been adopted into an undocumented offshoot, one so reclusive it had never been recorded. Others had different theories, that the tribe wasn't human in the way we define it, that something ancient, something older than language, had found Ethan and reshaped him, not against his will, but with it. Some saw mysticism, others saw biology pushed to the edge. Thomas refused to speculate. He simply said he chose, and that was enough. The case was never reopened. There was no closure form, no final press release. But the story spread among scientists, among parents of the missing, among those who believed the forest hides what the world refuses to understand. And on the edge of the jungle, where the trees grow thicker than law and older than memory, Ethan Langley became a whisper, a myth, a question. Was he still human? Was he watching? Was he waiting? No one knows. But sometimes, late at night, when the sky is clear and the canopy still, a distant whistle echoes through the trees. Not a warning, not a cry for help, just a sound that says, "I'm here." And sometimes that's the only answer we're given, because some disappearances aren't tragedies. They're transformations. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.